I went back to the Guard, and we were flying to Vietnam a lot. And that's another story, just doing that. Very emotional. Taking young men over there, bringing back body bags, and taking helicopter parts, ammunition. The first time I went to Tan Son Nhut, Saigon, we landed there, and we had ammunition on board, so they park us way back off the field. And I picked up a load of Marines one time and took them in to Chu Lai, which was a Marine base. And then just so happened a year later, I went back and picked up the same group. And they were, 18, 19 years old, and they looked like they were 35. I mean, some of them actually had gray hair and wrinkles and everything. They'd been through hell, literally. And we picked up some of their buddies and body bags. And man, that's tough. We had flight nurses on board, and they would take care of the wounded guys and the body bags and all the documentation. That was their job, and those girls were tough. Well, the first time I went to Tan Son Nhut, which was Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, we landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and it was huge. They had 2 parallel 12,000-foot runways, and the controller was Vietnamese, and one of the best air traffic controllers I ever saw. They were landing airplanes on opposite ends of the runway, opposite directions. They were landing airplanes on the taxiways. There were helicopters. There were civilian airliners. There was fighters. Everywhere, airplanes everywhere, and he didn't use any call signs. He just said F4 on final and go around. DC-8, you're cleared to land, and he was really good. And I was fascinated by that before we even hit the ground. And I'd never been to Vietnam. And we had all this ammunition on board, so we parked way off the field. And when we shut down, I got out onto the top of the wing while they were offloading the airplane. I'm watching all this activity. And 2 South Vietnamese Air Force Sky Raiders taxied out with bombs on board. And, they go out there and take off. And I watched them go, just over here a little ways, about a mile away. And they rolled in and dropped their bombs. And I'd never seen a bomb actually hit the ground. And I never heard a bomb drop, and it's pretty loud. And then I thought they had a range out there. And then I heard explosions around us, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were lobbing rockets onto the base, and I'm sitting on top of all this ammunition. So it was not a very comfortable feeling. But the thing that got me was the smell of cordite and rotting fish and the flesh and the humidity and the heat of Vietnam. And it's a distinctive smell that I can still smell today.
You cannot place statues or build memorials in thin air. These airplanes, rescued, restored, returned to the sky, are the memorials. Through them, we give enduring thanks to those who gave everything they had to defend everything that we hold dear. By sharing them, we remind each other of the sacrifice. By sharing them, we introduce our heirs to their heritage. One week each summer, these national treasures are flown here. Twice each day, those who restored them present them to those who risked their lives to fight in them. And those who really did it tell the rest of us how it really was. It is a singular series of history lessons that anyone who cherishes liberty ought to see.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about my second dad, Tex Hill. One of the most interesting men I've ever met. He was a college grad in 1937, unusual for a fighter pilot back then, not so much so now. He was a Navy pilot, flew SPDs in the Navy, and later the Kingfisher, which was a catapult launched off of a heavy cruiser. Observation plane, had one pontoon in the middle and outrigger on the outside. And you'd land back in the water, and then they'd take a catapult and pick you up and put you back on the catapult. So anyway, Tex was recruited by General Chenault to join the Flying Tigers, and he later became the most prolific ace of the Flying Tigers. He had a total of 23 victories in World War II. And I first met Tex back in the 80s, and we really became friends in the 90s. And he kind of took me under his wing, and he became my second dad. He was one of the funniest guys I've ever met. He had the greatest sense of humor, as all fighter pilots do. But we went up to Oshkosh, and he was at Aeroshell Square. Somebody else was interviewing him, not me. And they didn't know Tex. And they addressed him as General Hill, which nobody did. He was Tex. And this person said, "Well, General Hill, what do you like to do in your time off?" He said, "Oh, I like to hunt fish. I've been hunting and fishing all my life." Now, bear in mind, there's 5,000 people there listening to this, and I'm sitting in the car listening with a friend, Jim Cross. He said, "I've been hunting and fishing all my life." "Well, what do you like to hunt and fish?" this guy says. He said, "I like to shoot anything that's big and ugly and furry, kind of like Janet Reno when she was in power at that time." And the audience was stunned. Nobody said a word for about 30 seconds. And I looked at Jim, and he looked at me, and then we just busted out laughing, as did everybody else. It was hilarious. His timing was impeccable. He was just, and we had pilot training class reunion for me in San Antonio. So Tex and Maisie came over. And this joke was bad. I mean, I wouldn't tell it in a mixed crowd. But it became Tex's favorite joke. And they asked him to speak about the Flying Tigers, which he did for quite some time. And they loved it. They had clapped. And he started telling Aggie jokes, which he had thousands of. And he's telling Aggie jokes. And then he started to tell my joke. And I'm thinking, my God, he's not going to say the punchline, is he? And I looked at Maisie and I said, Maisie, he's not going to say the punchline, is he? She said, yep. And I'm so embarrassed because I had told him this joke, and now he's telling it to all my friends, and they're from all over the country, Mormons, you know, guys from all over the country and their wives. And he told that joke verbatim. And it was the same response we got at Oshkosh. Everybody was so stunned, they sat there for a few seconds, and then everybody just busted out laughing because it was hilarious. And he had a great, great sense of humor. Wonderful guy. I miss him a lot.
If John Wayne plays you in a movie, it would seem you've led an extraordinary life. In The Flying Tigers, John Wayne is said to have modeled his character after David Lee Tex Hill, one of the original American Volunteer Group, or AVG, Flying Tigers. In order to appreciate what the Flying Tigers did, you first have to understand the importance of the task they undertook. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Within 5 months, 1 million Chinese people were under Japanese control. By the end of 1937, all of the major cities in China were captured, including Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's capital of Nanking. Claire L. Chenault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer, was serving as an aviation advisor to Chiang Kai-shek during the Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese Air Force was non-existent. Generalissimo Chiang and Chenault sought and received U.S. permission to recruit Army, Navy, and Marine aviators and have them resign their commissions to join a contract volunteer force to defend China. The AVG Flying Tigers were born, and Tex Hill was one of its original recruits. China is a vast nation, and it valiantly fought on against the Japanese, even though there were 2 million Japanese soldiers in China by 1941. But in May of 1942, China nearly capitulated. Its supply lifeline was the 717-mile Burma Road, which ran from Lashio in Burma to Kunming in China. In May, the Japanese overran the American, British, and Chinese forces in Burma and completed the blockade of China. Soon, the Japanese 56th Division, the vaunted Red Dragons, were pouring up the road into China with only one remaining obstacle, the Salween River. An expansion bridge across the mile-deep river gorge had been destroyed by the retreating Chinese. But the Japanese had gone down to the river and already had a pontoon bridge under construction. That set the stage for one of the most memorable aerial combat missions in history. On May 7, 1942, Tex Hill and 3 other Flying Tigers in well-worn P-40s dived into the river gorge carrying 500-pound Russian-made bombs.
I led that mission on the 7th of May, 1942. So, if you knew your history, why, Rama was just about in Cairo at that time. Now, the Japanese had plans to go into India. If China had collapsed, the Indians would have turned on the Brits and slaughtered them like pigs. And it's conceivable that the Japanese and the Germans would have linked up across India and Africa, and we'd have had a different situation in the world. we probably wound up with some sort of negotiated peace because we didn't have the atomic bomb at that time. Of course, that solved everything, but that was almost 3 years later. Now, on May the 7th, when I was asked to lead a mission, the Chinese had blown the bridge, the main bridge there, but the Japanese had started building a pontoon bridge across. So I took a force of 8 planes. 4 of us were Navy guys that come out of a dive bombing squadron. We were loaded up with these big Russian bombs of 550 pounds roughly, and some frags on the wings. And I got up there and I saw that that pontoon bridge wasn't all the way across. Where that road winds down, that gorge is about a mile deep, and the road is cut back into the mountain. And so I was lucky enough to hit the road above with a bomb and knock the edge of the road off. And if I'd have hit above it and I had a landslide, they could shovel it off, and it wouldn't be any big problem. But when I knocked the edge of that road off, now they got to excavate back into that mountain, and that's rock, you know. But anyway, it blocked them, and for 3 days, they had no place to go. I mean, we slaughtered these guys. I don't know how many people we killed there, bombing and strafing them for 3 days. I don't think people have ever really understood the significance of that Salween mission. And now the people who were involved in that do, but none of the historians have really picked up on it and understand that this could have been an entirely different world, you know, if that mission had failed.
Tex Hill was a frequent visitor to Oshkosh. In 2007, just after celebrating his 92nd birthday, Tex was looking forward to hosting yet another Warbirds in Review forum. However, at the last minute, health considerations caused him to cancel. Among the dozens of sayings Tex used deftly and often was this one: if you want to have a friend, you have to be a friend. And Tex had friends. Friends like Don Lopez, deputy director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, who flew with Tex in China. He remembered Tex's inbox was filled with peanuts and his outbox was filled with the used shells, and that he had one standing brief: "Y'all follow me." And friends like David Hartman, longtime host of ABC's Good Morning America, and Joe Engle, the commander of the second ever space shuttle flight, and Ed and Connie Bowlin, founders of Warbirds in Review.
We have been at many black tie occasions with Tex, and on one occasion I happened to wear a red dress. And Tex, at no loss for words, I walk out of the room and there he is, and he said, "Oh, you make a bulldog break his chain."
And dozens of others who decided to fill Tex's forum time with a tribute to this beloved flyer, fighter, and friend. On October 11, 2007, Tex Hill, son of Presbyterian missionaries, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Chinese Order of the Cloud Banner, and the British Distinguished Flying Cross, passed away.
And then there was Gunther Rall. Gunther was also a great fighter pilot, the 3rd leading ace in history, 275 victories. Fought the entire war, from the Battle of Britain all the way through, and became a prisoner of war. And we went to Germany in '07 and filmed him at home. But Gunther was the most gracious, kindest guy I think I've ever met. Loved his wife up to the day he died. But also that great fighter pilot sense of humor they all have. He would love the jokes. One night we were down at Maxwell Air Force Base. Tex was there, Robin Olds was there, Gunther was there, a British ace, Chuck Yeager was there, Bud Anderson was there, and I was a bartender. And there was no way I could keep up with those guys, either drinking or even just making drinks. And I wish I'd had my camera that night because it was a night to remember. Those guys were singing fighter pilot songs from World War II in Korea, in Vietnam, and Gunther was singing the same songs in German. And it was hilarious. But the coolest thing he ever did to me was were at Oshkosh at his last interview I did in 2009. And we had finished the interview and got back in the car to go to the house. And he said, I'm tired, I need to take a nap. I said, okay. On the way over, he said, there's some good German people here in Oshkosh. I said, yes, there are. He said, I picked up some good sausage and cheese. Would you like to have lunch with me? And I said, no, sir, I've already had lunch. He said, would you make it for me? And I said, sure. So he sat down at the little island in the kitchen, and I said, what do you want on your sandwich? He said, one piece of toast. And I toasted the bread. I said, what do you want on it? He said, butter. So I get the butter out, and I put some butter on. He said, more. So I put more. He said, more. I put about a half a stick of butter on one slice of bread. I said, what else you want? He indicated 1/4 inch of sausage, so I cut that off, and 1/4 inch of cheese, and I cut that off. I said, what would you like to drink? He said, whiskey. And I said, what kind of whiskey? He said, well, Scotch, of course. So I poured the Scotch, I'm looking at him, the Scotch, into a glass about that much pure Scotch. I said, ice? He said, nein, no ice. They don't drink ice with ice in Germany. So he wolfed down the sandwich and took the Scotch and killed it. And when he did, he set the cup down with a flourish and stood up at attention like a German general would, a 3-star German general. And when he did that, I stood up in front of him. I didn't click my heels, but I almost did. I stood up in front of him. And he reached across and took his finger and tapped me on the shoulder. He said, Herr Hauptmann, my captain. I said, jawohl, mein General. He said, you are excused. I said, yes, sir. What time would you like me back? He said, 4 o'clock. I knew that didn't mean 4:02, so I was there at 3:45. And he was standing on the front porch when I pulled in the driveway, and he gave me a salute. Now, how cool is that? That was Gunther.
Who would think that on a Bluebird, Wisconsin afternoon in 2007, amid the flags and banners, the fun and the food of an air show, the greatest living combat ace in the history of aviation, a German, would be sitting under the wing of a T-6, protected from the sun by a Warbirds of America straw hat. His name is Gunther Rall. Technically, he is the third-ranking ace in history with 275 victories, but he is the greatest ace still alive. During the course of recording those victories, he was shot down 8 times, suffering, among other things, a broken back and the loss of his thumb. Gunther Rall became an American prisoner of war. 10 years after his last mission in an Me-109, Rall was asked to lead the new German Air Force. The new Luftwaffe procured the F-104G Starfighter from the U.S., which led Gunther to many visits to the U.S. for training and support. General Gunther Rall eventually became Germany's representative on the NATO Military Council in Brussels. Rall would be the last person on Earth to offer any kind of apologetic for serving the Third Reich as he did. In fact, he has said that the German people will pay for Hitler's racism for 1,000 years. In the foreword of Rall's biography, My Logbook, Bud Anderson, an American triple ace who first met Rall in 1975, wrote, "Germany, defeated in World War I, was a shattered nation shackled under the heavy reparations of the Versailles Peace Treaty. A boy named Gunther Rall, growing up under these conditions, had a close family relationship that instilled Christian values and discipline in his young, impressionable mind. As a member of the Boy Scouts, the spirit of adventure, a sense of belonging, and a desire to contribute to society reinforced his early upbringings. Gunther Rall's first choice was to serve his country in the infantry, but his friends soon convinced him flying was a much better path to tread." Anderson then goes on to say, "To this day, he has retained that agility, that decisiveness, that humor, and that sense of comradeship that unites fighter pilots beyond any national borders. I am happy to be able to call him friend." There will be very few remaining chances to hear, as this Warbirds in Review audience did, the first-person recollections of one man's meetings with Adolf Hitler.
First of all, you know, I have to say that today it's very easy Nazi officer. That's nonsense. An active officer was not allowed to be neither in the Weimar Republic nor with Hitler. He was not allowed to be a member of a party with the slogan, "The officer serves his country and not a party." My first contact with Hitler, or my report to Hitler, was 1942. I had my 100th victory, and I got the oak leaves, and I had to report in his headquarters in East Prussia. We were about 5. Druschel Steinhoff was with me, and some others. After delivering the order, we were sitting around a fireplace, and Hitler developed his plans. And the main interest was certainly the war in Russia. And Hitler, in those days, he had facts. You could say, yes, I accept that or not. But there were facts. He said, we have to flood the desert, and we have to put German farmers in the area together with the Russians to train them, and all things like that. So this was factual things. And, you know, when the war started, we had a leading newspaper in Germany. This was the Volksbeobachter. And the main journalist had a headline, "When the first snow falls, the war is over, Russia." When the first snow fall, I was in the tent in Poltava, minus 30 degrees, and when the guards came at night, we had open fire in the tent. And this came to my mind, and I interrupted. Hitler said, "Mein Führer, how long will the war in Russia last?" The other one got a shock. "Are you crazy? Interrupt the Führer?" So why not? He said that. I got a clear answer. He said, no, things. Rall, I don't know. And this shocked me the first time. Hitler didn't know one thing. Otherwise, he always knew. He knew everything. I don't know. This was 42. We were just ahead of Stalingrad, and there was a euphoristic mentality because in 2 weeks we have done it. You know, it was Stalingrad was a turning point of the war. And 9 months later, I had again to report to Hitler. I got the swords. It was a different Hitler. There was not facts anymore to do this. It was, you know, no facts anymore. And this was very interesting when you saw his signature. Here, RF Hitler was almost this. The longer the war lasted, it went down. Yeah, and the third time was in January 44, and the main theme, which was discussed, was certainly the expected invasion. When, where, and how can we counter? It was pessimistic, and the belief. Also, that is important. I was often asked, when were you convinced that you lose the war? Stalingrad was the first hit and turning point, and the next was the pocket battle of Kursk, when the German tank army was seriously hit by the Russians, and from there on, we never had any move to the east. I came back to my wife on a trip to another front line, and I said, Harry, the war is lost. And all these secret weapons, so nobody believed on that. But, you cannot just throw your weapon away. We were in a deadly war, no doubt. We have to see how we come out best. That was the problem.
Even in the cauldron of combat, the humor and irony of the human condition sometimes shows itself in surprising ways.
We got an alarm takeoff, and I at the Caucasus Mountains, Terek River, I went up, and I just took up an airplane which was ready to go, but they missed the watch was not in. There was in the panel a hole, and I went up 7,000 meters, as 21,000 feet, and I was looking around. All of a sudden, somebody looked at me through that hole. It was a mouse. And I was so happy I was not alone. Somebody was escorting me, and the mouse got nervous because she didn't have an oxygen mask. I had one, don't need to speak. And then all of a sudden it disappeared again in the system. After landing, we never found that mouse.
Gunther Rall's last combat mission was on May 12, 1944. On that day, some 800 Allied bombers, protected by over 900 U.S. fighters, were headed for the Rhine-Main industrial area of central Germany. German ships had picked up the American radio traffic and alerted the Luftwaffe. Gunther's airplane was one of 75 German fighters to answer the challenge. Not only was he flying against long odds, he was flying against the most successful fighter group in the European theater, Colonel Hub Zemke's Wolfpack. It was in that fight Gunther's left thumb was shot off. Another Warbirds in Review participant, Robert Shorty Rankin, remembers that day for a different reason. On that day, in that battle, he became the first P-47 pilot to score 5 victories on the same mission.
We would fly close formation 45 minutes ahead of the bombers into Frankfurt, and then we'd split up like this in a fan, and I was in this westernmost flight. We were supposed to fly 15 minutes and then do a reciprocal on that heading and come back. Well, I completed a 15 minutes, turned around and come back, and I heard everywhere I listened, everybody was seeing bogeys. The Germans were all over the place. And shortly after that, I looked in front of me, and there's a gaggle of 109s, close formation, still had their tanks on. So with my flight of 4, I pressed the attack, and they saw us coming, and all of a sudden, all those tanks went off at the same time, and they don't go down like a bomb, they flutter. And I'd never seen that. That got my attention, but only for a short time, and I pressed on to make the attack. And they saw us coming, obviously, and then the whole gaggle did split S's. They went in every direction. And I picked out 2 and tied onto them, and away we go. Nothing could dive with the P-47. But we did know this, that the 109 supposedly could not pull out if it was vertical at 5,000 feet. Well, it saved my life knowing that, because I'm really concentrated. And you have tunnel vision when you're getting ready to fire. And I'm watching this, all of a sudden the wings start to flutter and it looked pretty sad, something was about to happen. So I looked at my speed indicator and I was doing 575 straight down, and right away I got both hands on the stick, felt like it was in concrete, we're approaching compressibility. So long story short, the 109 splashed, I pulled out just above the tree level and got up out of there. So that was my first victory on that day, and I got up to 8,000 feet. You're always climbing for altitude. I got to 8,000, I looked down, there's a lone 109 flying by itself, going east, made a pass down on, gave him a good burst, and it did 2 violent snap throw, boom, boom, and turned and went straight in. So that was the second one. So I pulled up from that, started to climb, and our leader, Hubzemke, Fairbanks leader, I'm 10 miles south of Koblenz, I'm over the whole Luftwaffe. That's quite a statement. I make this great big wide orbit, and it wasn't like a mile, it was a big wide orbit. Before I could get on with somebody without somebody immediately on my tail. Finally, I sound 2, they're only about 50 feet apart. I pulled onto one to the left, they didn't move, they didn't do anything to evade me. I gave them a good burst. Smoke started to come from it and the right gear fell out. So it started a slow spiral going down. I just had a little right rudder. Same thing happened to that one. His right gear fell out. And it was the 2 of them going spiraling down together. That was my 3rd and 4th of that day. So about that time, I looked over, and there's a 109 climbing up onto Hubzemke's butt. And I called to him, and I said, "Break," you know. He said, "Where is it?" And like a dumb lieutenant, I said, "He's climbing right up under your ass." And I thought he'd get all over me when we got back to briefing, but he didn't say one thing about that. And I managed to just get a few short bursts around the cockpit. Excuse me, I didn't think I had him, but the airplane slid off to the right and the pilot bailed out. And that was my 5th for the mission.
In another one of the historical paradoxes which have become so common during Warbirds in Review, Gunther had the chance to reminisce with Shorty Rankin 63 years after the fact about that fateful day, a day which ended so differently for each of them. Gunther bailing out of his Me-109 with a severed thumb.
And then I was tumbling and tumbling and tumbling and tumbling. I couldn't reach the handle. But, you know, when these arms and legs are swinging around, this is a stabilizing factor for you. And all of a sudden, it was quiet. I was looking how high, and I pulled, and here I was on the parachute. And then I recognized, I said, "Shorty, where's my thumb?"
And Shorty getting a special reward.
We went back to our base, got out of the airplane, held up 5 fingers, and my crew chief was thrilled to death, and so was I. So went in and debriefed, and told our story like I'm telling you here, and got a pat on the back from the group commander, and he said, "I tell you all what, I want to make sure that the ranking gets a whole chicken tonight at the officers' mess." That was my reward.
What advice do these warriors have for us today?
If there is a war, you have to serve your country. There's no doubt. And the other one on the other side, he serves his country. And we both in the front line, he and me, we suffer from the damned political failures the behind make, you know, that's it. But this is a common fate, yeah, and it binds together, and the same thinking, the same feeling, the same mentality to a certain degree.
I'll be all right. I'm a very emotional guy for a fighter pilot, I'll tell you, but I love this country, and every young person who lives here ought to be blessed to know that they've been so fortunate to be born here. And when the time comes, if you have to do your thing for your country, you better damn well step up to the bat and do it. Anybody who's so fortunate, he feels the same about his country. And I feel that way, but also you got to remember, all 3 wars and I'm still here. I'm 88. I feel fine. I'd go to tomorrow and fight, but I wouldn't fight against Gunther. We're friends.
I know.
General Robin Olds was one of the greatest fighter leaders in history. He was an ace in World War II in P-38s, flew P-51s in World War II. I forget exactly how many victories he had. 379th Fighter Group. Then he skipped Korean War because he was an exchange officer with the RAF in England. And he flew Vampires over there, jet fighters. And then when the Vietnam War came up, he was a bird colonel, and he became commander of the Triple Nickel, the 555th Fighter Wing in Thailand. They were based in Thailand. And they didn't have guns on the F-4s back then. They only had missiles, which didn't work. Half of them, or 3/4 of the missiles failed. So Robin said, we need a gun. And the Air Force said, no, you don't. You got missiles. And Robin says, okay, fine, thank you. Then he goes back with his sergeant and he fabricated a machine gun pod that worked, a minigun that worked on the F-4 himself with his sergeant, his maintenance sergeant, against Air Force orders. So they started shooting down airplanes. And his morale of his troops went way up. And Robin shot down a bunch of airplanes. He never would tell me exactly how many. I'm thinking I've heard as many as 7 himself. And if you shot down 5, you became an ace. And they sent you home. And he was the group commander, a bird colonel, so he wanted to stay there with his men. That's called leadership. So we were at this function in North Georgia, and that my sister-in-law put on, and we had Robin there, and Tex Hill, and Bud Anderson, and some other aces there, and it was a big symposium that my sister-in-law Connie had put together. And Tex was upstairs with me. He and Robin had ridden with me in my car that night. And this place had a bar upstairs and a bar down below. And there was a lot of people, 200 or 300 people there at this symposium. And they were rubbing elbows with these famous aces, and they were not ready to leave yet. And people had a lot of liquor, you know, having a really good time. And Tex was tired and in his 80s at the time. And he said, Danny, I'm tired. Go get Robin. I said, yes, sir. And I went downstairs, beautiful wooden structure, and they had a big wooden bar, and there was about 10 or 15 pilots there, and they're talking to Colonel Robin Olds, the greatest fighter leader of all time. And he's holding court, had a lot to drink, and he was in his element with the big handlebar mustache, and man, he looked like a fighter pilot, big broad shoulders, and had been a All-America tackle at West Point. He was in the College Football Hall of Fame, and just what you think a colonel in the Air Force should look like, okay? But Tex Hill was a flying tiger, and Tex Hill had been Robin's boss in the Air Force, in the first jet fighter unit in the United States Air Force. Tex was a commander, and Robin was a young fighter pilot. So Tex had been his boss, and they both were brigadier generals, retired at the time. So I go bebopping down the stairs to this bar, and there's Robin there, and I noticed he had a fresh drink. And he is telling fighter pilot stories and talking to these guys, and these pilots, their eyes are wide open, and they're just lapping all this up. And I said, I didn't know these guys, so I addressed him as General Olds instead of Robin. And I said, General Olds, sir? I said, we are ready to go. And he went ballistic. What? Ready to go? I just got a fresh drink. Who says we're ready to go? I said, General Hill. He put his drink down. He says, I'll follow you. That's how much respect he had for Tex. That was General Robin Olds, a great leader.
If you could take the genes from the consummate military leader and combine them with the genes of the consummate fighter pilot, the result might look just like this. However, if you created a fictional military hero with Brigadier General Robin Old's resume, an editor would likely reject it for being beyond believable. In 1942, Olds was an All-American tackle for West Point. In 1943, he was commissioned a second lieutenant and completed pilot training. He entered World War II flying a P-38 he named Scat-1. As he progressed through different iterations of fighter planes, he simply kept adding Roman numerals to the Scat name. He finished the war in a P-51 named Scat-7. In addition to becoming a double ace plus with 12 aerial victories, he destroyed another 11 1/2 aircraft on the ground. He later became the wingman on the Air Force's first aerobatic jet team. In 1966, he became commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand. Robin Olds flew 152 combat missions in Southeast Asia in F-4 Phantoms, 105 of them over North Vietnam. He shot down 2 North Vietnamese MiG-17s and 2 MiG-21s. Robin Olds was famous for something else. He never learned to mince words or play politics with the mission of the military, as those in the Warbirds in Review audience learned when Olds described his return from Vietnam.
I got home about the last day of September, 1st of October, on a Friday. My family in Washington, and I'm on leave. Phone rang Saturday. Said, get over here to the Pentagon. Chief of Staff wants to see you Monday morning. I said, I'm on leave. He said, doesn't matter, the chief wants to see you. I said, yes, sir, okay. I reported into his office. He's the one that walked up to me and said, take off that mustache. Yes, sir. The next thing I knew, he briefed me, and I'm in the Oval Office of the White House. You know, God, me? LBJ was the president. So I'm sitting on the end of a couch. He's on an easy chair, and his aide, a colonel, Air Force colonel, was sitting on my right. And Mr. President said, welcome home, Colonel. You did well. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah, well, what's it like to be home? That was the weekend that thousands and thousands of hippies marched on the Pentagon. I said, sir, who are all those funny-looking people that marched on the Pentagon yesterday? And I'm going to quote for you folks. He said, I got 240,000 boys over there in Vietnam. When those boys come home, they'll tell the American public what's happening. And I thought, wait a minute. That's your job, not mine. Well, of course, you don't say that. So the best thing I could think of to come up with, sir, I've been home since Friday. Been to a couple of dinner parties. No one asked me where I've been or what I've been doing for the past year. In case somebody does ask, what would you like me to tell them? I'm thinking, end of career. He glared at me, and then he said, well, Colonel, you tell them, I'm quoting, that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't say that. Well, why not, Colonel? Well, sir, if that's why we're there, I don't want to be the one that spreads the word. Ooh. It was grim for a few minutes, but I hand the man full credit. He let me talk. He listened. And he sent me down the next morning to talk to his chief security advisor in the basement of the White House. We argued for a couple of hours. But this security advisor and I argued. At one point I said something. He said, we can't do that. That'll bring down the Chinese. I said, the Chinese and the North Vietnamese have hated each other for a couple of thousand years. They fought wars against each other. Haven't you read their history? No, he hadn't. So finally he said, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, for God's sakes, sir, mine the harbors, because everything they used came in by ship bottom. Gas, missiles, ammunition, everything, food. His response, when I said mine the harbors, was, we can't do that. That's an act of war. Now mind you, this was about the 2nd or 3rd of October of 1967. I wonder if he ever wondered what the hell we were doing over there. Now, it was, I maintain we had every reason to be there, but we went about it improperly under the leadership of McNamara and Johnson.
Sadly, Robin Olds passed away on June 14, 2007.
One of the best fighter pilot that I have ever seen, and this has been verified by a lot of people, including people that flew with him in World War II, is Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson. Colonel Bud Anderson is a 16 victory ace in World War II, 357th Fighter Group, one of the most famous fighter groups in history, the first all P-51 group in the 8th Air Force. He has some fascinating stories about World War II, and I've been around him many times. I've interviewed him many times. I've been at social functions with him. I've had dinner with him. I've been at his home. He's a personal friend of mine and a wonderful guy who's the most unassuming fighter pilot you ever saw. He's a grandfather and great-grandfather and very calm, cool customer. And I've flown with a lot of pilots in my life, and I had a situation down here in Georgia when Bud had not flown a P-51 in probably 40 years, and he was going to check out again in the P-51. This has been 20 years ago. And I was here with my brother and Connie, and the T-6 was outside in the hangar, and wisely he flew the Cup for a while, and flew the T-6 a while. And he wanted to fly again. Ed and Connie were both tied up, and Ed said, would you fly with Bud? And I said, man, I'd love to. I've never flown with him. So he's up in front of the T-6, and I was pretty qualified at the time in the airplane. And all you pilots that are looking at this will know that a T-6 is a difficult airplane to fly. It's a ground looper, and a powerful airplane, great aerobatic airplane. So we go out and we are flying, and I had flown a lot recently, but I'm sitting back there watching him. And we started off making landings in the grass, which is easier. You make nice smooth landings, and he squeaked it on the grass. And he said, I think I'll make a 3-point landing now, and he made a perfect 3-point landing. I think I might go over to the concrete and I'm gonna make a wheel landing. He lands on the main gear, squeak, squeak. Both tires hit exactly the same time. The tail came down. The airplane was perfectly straight. He did about 20 of those. And I said, Colonel, I fly this thing all the time, and I make about 1 out of 3, and you just did 20 in a row. He just laughed. Then we went over to another airport and did some more narrow runway landings. Then we go up. He said, do you mind if I do some aerobatics? And I said, oh, I don't mind. I'm loving it. So the hardest thing you can do in a T-6 is a slow roll, because when you go to roll the airplane, you have to use rudder to keep the nose up because the nose is so heavy. So when you get quarter of the way through, you got to put left rudder to keep the nose up. When you get halfway through, you got to put forward elevator to keep the nose up. And when you get 3/4 of the way around, you got to put right elevator to keep the nose up. And it's a very hard thing to do, and do it slowly, where the nose never moves, which he did. The first thing he did was the hardest thing you do, and that nose never moved. And I've never been able to do that myself. I tried, I've gone up and tried it 20 or 30 times. I can't do it. He did it perfect the first time, and he hadn't flown the airplane in 40 years. Then the next day, he flew the Mustang, and I was there when he flew it. And when he got back off the ground, I got up on the wing of the Mustang, and I took his shoulder straps off. And I said, "What were you thinking?" He said, "Nobody was shooting at me." And he just smiled. And that's Colonel Bud Anderson.
In an airplane, the guy was a mongoose. It's hard to believe if the only Bud Anderson you knew was the one on the ground. Calm, gentlemanly, a grandfather, funny, an all-round nice guy. But once you got him in an airplane, he's vicious. Shot down 17 airplanes. Best fighter pilot I've ever seen. The man who spoke those words would certainly be in a position to know. He flew with Bud Anderson in England as part of the celebrated 357th Fighter Group. Bud became a triple ace in the P-51 Mustang, racking up 16 1/4 kills over 2 tours of duty. Flying 116 missions in his venerable Old Crow, Anderson was so skilled that he was never hit by an enemy aircraft and never turned back for any reason. In fact, he can only recall one occasion when an enemy pilot was able to get behind him. Little wonder that General Chuck Yeager called him the best he's ever seen. There were 30 years of continuous service for this soft-spoken farm kid from Central California, including some of the most dangerous post-war flight testing done by the Air Force. Commanding a squadron of F-86 jets in Korea, and 25 combat missions in F-105s during the Vietnam War. To understand Bud Anderson, you have to understand just how much flying means to him. And he won't try to tell you that. He once wrote, "How do you explain this sort of feeling to those who don't fly? How do you explain color to somebody blind from birth?" Not only does Bud continue to fly well into his 80s, thanks in large part to his friendship with NASCAR legend Jack Roush, he continues to fly Mustangs. Roush, of course, has a fascination for machines that go fast. But in addition to that, he has a deep interest in and respect for the men and airplanes who have flown in harm's way to defend this country.
I think that period of time, World War II and all the mobilization of the economy and the industry and all, was one of America's proudest periods when we're able to pull together as a country and go take care of our interests and go defend ourselves for what our beliefs were. And so that's a proud part of American history that I share with today with Bud and with the other fellows that survived. My father was in the war, and I certainly lost him in the meantime, but certainly remember his sacrifice as well as the sacrifice of all Americans who participate in any way. The idea of being able to preserve the hardware creates the forum to have the discussions and to remember, where we came from and what our roots are. It's really important.
And how did Jack and Bud become such fast friends?
I was always a race fan, but I didn't follow it avidly. And can't remember when I really first heard of him, but it was like I knew him, you know, because of the race things. I can't pick a date, but
I can help you with that. I called you up. I called you up in probably November of 1992, and I said, I bought this airplane. I want to give it a historically significant motif. Do you have something you can send me that would give me something to think about? And you dug into your archives and got out a bunch of pictures, made me photocopies. But from my initial inquiry about who we could honor with recreating an airplane that would celebrate their military career, Colonel Anderson never offered the Old Crow as a possibility, and his being the recipient of that exposure, he never offered that. Other people around him made that suggestion.
But the fact that Bud Anderson was too modest to suggest Roush paint the Mustang in the Old Crow scheme doesn't mean that it wasn't important to him.
for me, at my age, to be able to fly is pretty special. But then to be able to fly a Mustang is even more special. But then to fly a Mustang that's painted just like the one I flew in World War II is pretty special. I mean, it gets me right here. I can't say enough about Jack Roush for doing what he's done for me.
And so it goes with this modest American hero. Ask him about his exploits, he'll tell you about his crew.
You know, the fighter pilots get all the press and all the whatever, you know. You never hear about the crew chiefs and the kind of support that we had. But think about it a little bit. If you're the crew chief of this airplane or any airplane, it's your airplane and you got your pilot and you know he gets a kill and you paint that thing on there. It's your kill too. I had a crew chief from the time I was in Otto Heino, time I was in training, and my first tour. Then he got promoted to tech sergeant and was a line chief, and he was responsible for six or eight airplanes. And the winter of 1944, 1945 was considered one of the 100-year winters that they had in Europe. I got a brand new D, this tail number, just like this, but it was solid olive drab when I first got it. And I remember I was the operations officer then, so we were flying mixed airplanes. You've seen these things. Some of them are silver, some are OD, some are half and half. You've seen the pictures of them. That's just one piece in time, the way the airplane looked. They went through tremendous different paint configurations. So this day, I'm looking down, and in the snow background, it was white, 2 dark airplanes and 2 silver airplanes. Well, which one was hiding? It wasn't the camouflaged airplane. And I thought, you know, I know I'm going to finish in the winter. I said, when I landed, there's my 2 crew members and Otto Heino are standing there, and I said, why don't you paint this, de-paint it and put it in a silver paint scheme like this right here, just exactly like this. And I figured that would take, gosh, you know, what, a couple of days at least? That seemed like a lot of work to me. And I said, whenever it's laid up for heavy maintenance, let's do that. Now, I did put it on the basis of it might save my butt, you know, it might give me a tactical advantage, although honestly I thought this paint scheme was a little cooler than the dark one, but I did have some basis there. And I talked to them, and they all kind of nodded their head, and I went in there, and I was the operations officer, decided to fly the next day. Went home next morning, had our briefing and breakfast, and come out, and I got my parachute, and I walked out over my revetment was right close to where the airplane was parked, walked up over it, and I looked down, and there's that Mustang sitting there looking just like this. And these three guys were kind of standing there at attention, and I looked at them, and I looked at their hands, and their hands were raw, and there was blood showing on them, and I felt like a jerk. And I thought, God, did they think I gave them a direct order for that? And then I thought about it a little bit, and I said, you know, those guys, they did it because they wanted to, and they'd worked on that airplane from the instant I'd left and had it ready to go. It's just kind of incredible. But that's just an example. I can't remember when we being short anything over there, and I take my hat off to all the crew chiefs of the world.
I've had the honor to help MC a number of presentations that Colonel Anderson has made to the public, both at Oshkosh and some other places around the country. And what always comes to mind to me as I get ready to go in front of the public with Bud is to remember, take note of the fact that he's one of America's greatest heroes. The kind of person, as a man and as a young man, as an adult, that we'd all like to have been ourselves, or we'd certainly like for our children to be. And so he's a great patriot and a great brave defender of our country and our freedoms. He's one of the world's greatest aviators. You know, he's an inspiration to me in every way that I could tell you as it relates to being a father and a warrior and a man.
They tied me up on a big column in the lobby with my hands behind me like this, and the wives would come by and spit on me.
Mr. President, I've been home since Friday, been to 2 dinner parties. No one asked me where I've been for the past year or what I've been doing. In case someone does, what would you like me to say? And he said, well, Colonel, you tell them that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam. I said, sir, I can't say that.
And then when Hitler very eloquently discussed his plans factually, I interrupted him. Sagte, mein Führer, you have to address him with this, mein Führer, how long does the war in Russia last? Or when is the war finished? My camera, shocked, interrupting Hitler. Rall, this I don't know. The great leader doesn't know about his plans when he's finishing the war against Russia.
But in retrospect, I wish I had talked more about my military record. I think that it would have strengthened my criticism of the Vietnam War if I could say, you know, in World War II we didn't have this, we didn't do this. We had a clear objective.
They are all stories that began in a simpler time, and in the very different place that was the world of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. In the wonder, innocence, and anticipation of their youth, they could scarcely know that one fateful day they would be called to defend with their lives, their families, and their homes. Called from the hills of Tennessee and the Dakota Prairie, from the rivers of Ohio and the orchards of California, from New York City and the Bavarian Alps, called to defend the very lands of their birth in the most cataclysmic conflict in the history of the world. Then, after literally saving the world that shaped them, they quietly went home to shape a new world of cars and interstate highways and television, of atomic energy and computers, of space travel and the internet, of wonders so mind-boggling and life-changing they threatened to overwhelm that defining adventure of their youth. But if you have been to war, you never forget it. No matter how much the world has changed, you do not forget what you experienced and what you learned when your life was in peril. And now they are leaving. More than 1,000 of them a day are dying, and all that they saw and felt and learned and did is leaving with them. Realizing that, we have a new national interest in the greatest generation. In many ways, this is a story of passage, and it is the story of a place like other places where a departing generation entrusts its cultural legacy to those who will carry on, where they will tell, in some cases for the last time, those who have ears to hear what it was really like and what they learned from it. The stories are countless in number and as different as snowflakes. For a little while longer, you can hear them from the mouths of those who wrote them. You can hear many of them here on an airfield in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, in a forum called Warbirds in Review.
Welcome to Scott's Warbird Alley. You thought you were going to see the B-17 show, didn't you? Well, guess what you are. We looked all over the field for a B-17. The one we had planned to use is stuck in the mud down here. We call this slosh-kosh now. But anyway, we're going to make do with this beautiful P-51. I thought it was appropriate to use a P-51 since the B-17s and the P-51s served together in the 8th Air Force in World War II. I'd like to introduce my guest today. Right here to my right is Uncle Jack Sinise. You recognize that name? Uncle Jack Sinise, Gary Sinise, one of our country's greatest actors. This is his uncle. And next to Uncle Jack was also another B-17 navigator, Don Casey. Don, pleasure to have you up here, sir. This wonderful book here was written by Don Casey. It's called To Fight for My Country, Sir. And it's about being a B-17 navigator in World War II, which both of these gentlemen were. They served in the same group, and they're going to talk about their training experiences on the B-17, and we're going to talk about that airplane, that wonderful airplane, of which this is the 75th anniversary of the B-17. It was designed in 1935. And I'm sorry we don't have one here to look at, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. Don, let me start with you. Let's talk about training, navigator training back in the 40s.
Well, 1943, when Jack and I started training, we were not together then and didn't know each other then. But we went through the aviation cadet program, which was moving at a very fast pace at that time because the 8th Air Force, which was primarily engaged in battle over Europe, was suffering horrendous losses due to the fact that they were not escorted by the P-51 fighters, which didn't exist at that time. In 43, 2 missions were flown, for example, to Schweinfurt, Germany, unescorted. And one was in August and one was in October. On each one of those missions, 60 B-17s were shot down with crews of 10 apiece, or 600, and the loss was 20% on those 2 occasions. Well, you can't keep up flying on a 20% loss ratio. You got 5 missions, you're gone. That was the experience of flying without fighter escort. But Jack and I got there from training. We both joined the 379th Bomb Group at Kimbolton, England, in the Midlands, and we did some more training there and started flying.
Jack, when you started your navigator training and you finished up and actually got your wings, did they pair you with other crew members at that time?
Well, what they did after you graduated, then you were assigned to a crew.
Wait a minute, we have a mic problem. Try this one.
Yeah. After we graduated, you were assigned to a crew, and of course the first thing you heard was, well, don't get sent to Pio, Texas. We trained in San Marcos, Texas, which is near Austin, but they say don't get sent to Pio, Texas, because it's nothing out there. All it is sky, horizon, and desert, and rattlesnakes. Well, that didn't sound like the kind of place you wanted to go to, but naturally, when you looked on the board, there it was, Pio, Texas, for both of us. So when we got to Pio, why, we were assigned to a crew, and that's where you first met your pilot, co-pilot, and the gunners, and so forth. So, and then at that time, we started to fly around and get used to each other, and we didn't, as I say, we didn't do any bombing or anything like that, but we just, the pilots, you figure the pilot was new, the co-pilots new, so you have to kind of get together and get to know each other. So that's how we started, at Pio, Texas. And then we did go, from that point, after a month or so, we went to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and did some more training. Not a whole lot, but that was our first real altitude mission at that time, which on our first flight we didn't make. We got up so far, and one of the engines started to go out, so we had to land at Stuttgart, Arkansas, and spend a couple days there while they put the plane back together again. But we did finally get through Dyersburg, and the next thing we're then shipped up to Kearney, Nebraska, where, and this was right after the first of the year, Nebraska gets a few blizzards and that type of thing, and the next thing you know, why, they say, well, you're going to be leaving here soon, and you're going to be given a brand new B-17, and you're going to fly it over to England. Well, that seemed, well, a little impossible that we're going to do all that, but I remember calling back home, telling my folks, we're going to be leaving pretty soon, and if we can, we'll fly over the house, because I lived in the south suburb of Chicago at the time. Well, the only problem was that we didn't fly over my hometown of Blue Island. We flew over Joliet, Illinois at 3 o'clock in the morning, and there wasn't anybody out there waving towels and the rest of it. But when I mentioned it to my mother sometime later, and she said, oh, well, there was B-17s flying over, and we'd run out there and wave towels and so forth. Well, I said, well, the only thing is you didn't wave at us. But we did fly on from there. Our pilot, Steve King, he came from Akron, Ohio, and we got to Akron pretty much just after dawn, and we did fly over his house. That was one of the things. Should I take it from there? Well, from there we went up to Maine, and finally ended up at Goose Bay, Labrador, where the snow was so high. I mean, the runways were just tunneled more or less right through the snow drifts, and the snow was actually over the plane by as far as being cut out where the runways were. And the next thing we're getting a briefing. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but we're getting a briefing of how we're going to fly from there to Iceland, to Scotland, and end up dropping off the plane there. So we took off at night, and really you couldn't see the stars or anything like that. You just had a flight plan that they had put together based on what they knew as far as the winds and the conditions and so forth. I remember one thing they said, don't get too close to Greenland because the mountains are kind of high. And the one thing about Greenland, they had a radio beam that was directed directly south of Greenland. And at least when you went by that, you got one more or less, one fix that you knew at least, well, I'm that far. After that, you were on your own flying over the Atlantic. So we ended up finally landing in Iceland. And we were there a couple days, and then flew to Prestwick, Scotland, dropped off the plane. Well, then I'll let you take it from there. Then.
Don, you were a 19-year-old navigator. Had you ever been out of the country?
No. I'd been to Canada maybe, but that was about it. Cuba when I was 2 years old, but not out of the country to speak of. And I wanted to go back to Iceland for a minute. When we landed there, we were in a different plane, of course, and we landed and we went in to have a drink at the officers' club, and we spent the night there. I met a Red Cross nurse, very lovely lady, who said, "Oh, your name is Casey." Well, there was a fellow named Casey went through here not too long ago, and he said he was going to be the hottest B-17 pilot in the 8th Air Force. Well, he wound up in the next room to me in Germany when I finally got there. The thing I remember about going to our new group, and Jack and I, again, were in different crews, but the navigators got no respect. We were the Rodney Dangerfields of the aircrew. We didn't do anything. You couldn't see what we were doing. And all we did was get them there and get them back, wherever it was. So it was a mystery what the navigators did, and most people thought, well, nothing much. And then if you're flying in a formation, as we flew in formations of 20 to 30 planes, depending on how many were available that particular day on a mission. So that if you were back in the formation, you were, as a navigator, merely keeping track of where you were. The lead navigator was guiding to where you were going to go, and we all followed the leader in tight formation. Keep in mind, I'm 19, Jack is 20, and we had a colonel who was a West Pointer named Maurice Preston, and I don't think he could ever get over the idea that 19-year-old kids could come over there ranked as second lieutenants after he had taken 4 years of West Point to become a lieutenant, and all of a sudden here we are Army of the United States. Well, as far as I was concerned, he didn't think anything of us at all. I had the chance to show him what we could do, though, one day, and that was flying a mission. I think it was my 24th, and we were told to fly down to another base, get out of our plane, and do what they told us. Well, they don't tell the navigator anything, you know. So I got out, I got in this plane, and pretty soon a colonel came on board and sat in the co-pilot's seat, and 2 bombardiers came on board. This was June the 12th of 1944, 6 days after the invasion. We were bombing an airfield behind the invasion lines. Well, I'm sitting there waiting for somebody to tell me what I'm supposed to do. All of a sudden, we're taking off. The plane is taking off. And I say, I must be the navigator. Well, Jack had been to a 2-week training course for lead navigators. I had never gotten any idea of that, so I didn't know what to do except to just navigate. Fortunately, it was only a 100-mile trip, but we flew in over the invasion front, and we dropped our bombs, and we got back to England and came back to our own base. On arrival at the base, they said, "We want to talk to you. Come into the office, please. You know, you were not supposed to do that. That was a mistake." I mean, how could that be? A mistake? Because it was a case of mistaken identity. The other group thought I was a trained lead navigator, and I didn't know what I was doing there, so I went out and flew the mission. But they said, we're gonna promote you. You've done the job now, so you're a lead navigator, but we're going to put you on a deputy lead ship. Oh, and what is the deputy lead? Well, you'll love that. It happens to be the hottest. They didn't say this. They kept it all a secret. It happens to be the hottest spot in the formation because all the guns on the ground are aiming at the lead ship. And we had already lost 3 deputy lead planes. Not a lead ship, but 3 deputy lead planes. So I thought, well, this sounds great. I wrote home to the folks, and I'm just being promoted to deputy leader. Well, 2 missions on deputy lead, and we're hit and shot down. Now, that shoot-down experience is unique. And what you don't think about is that what do you do when your plane is on fire and the pilot says bail out? And you have not practiced any of that. You don't know what to do. You don't know anything about where you are, except the target was Hamburg, Germany that day. The previous August, British and Americans had flown 3 nights and days and bombed Hamburg so badly that 75,000 civilians were killed or made homeless. So, unbeknownst to us, Hamburg was the worst place you could pick to get shot down. They had distinct memories of what it was like to be bombed the way we had bombed them, and the civilians were told by Adolf Hitler, it's all right to take your revenge on the flyers that are parachuting out of the planes. And Hitler further ordered that the troops should not interfere with the civilians taking their revenge on us. Well, as a result, 2 of our guys were beaten to death on the ground. 1 was shot in his parachute. 1 more was killed when the plane blew up. 2 more had ropes around their neck and were rescued by the soldiers. I had a unique experience, as everyone was. You don't all land together. You're scattered all over the countryside. And I landed in a little suburban area right across from a military hospital in which the wounded German soldiers are hanging out the window watching me come down in my big white umbrella. And so what did I do when I landed? The memory was, hide your parachute. So I hid my parachute. They're watching me across the street.
Jack?
And I'll cut this short, but I was rescued by 2 German soldiers with guns, and we had been told, you have a .45 automatic, you can carry that if you want to, but we don't recommend it because the Germans can shoot you just because you have a gun and say, well, he tried to pull a gun on me, so he shot him. So I didn't carry a gun. I put my hands up, and the war was over for me. They took me to an air raid shelter for a brief time. I sat amongst the German civilians while the rest of the raid was going on. And then they took me to a camp compound in Hamburg where I recognized the name over the stockade. And in a book I had read in the previous high school, I'm only 19, so back when I was 17, I read this book about this prison camp at Fuhlsbüttel in Hamburg where they beat and tortured the prisoners. Well, it turned out that this was not the same prison, but from there they took us to the Great Escape Camp. I'll pass the mic over to Jack.
Jack, let's talk about the crew members that you met. You guys are all young, 18 to 22 years old for the most part. And you didn't really want to make friends because they were losing so many people. You touched on that. I think in 42, when the 8th Air Force went into England, every time they went on a mission, they lose about 1/3. So you didn't want to make friends.
1943 is when.
Yeah.
Well, the thing with it is that you train with your crew when you get over there, and the way the mission started out, you're going to go on your first mission now after we did some practicing around England, and so you don't know what's going to happen. And when I was asked about it before, we flew into France, and so the first time that you see the flag starting to come up, well, that's gee, look at that, these little bursts around, and then you're looking over and you see a plane get hit, that goes down, but it was like a movie. It wasn't happening to you. It's just you're out there watching this thing. I think it took about 5 missions before you suddenly realized that somebody was shooting at you, and that one of those that you were watching could be you. But initially, I wasn't really scared. I just, because you don't know what's going to happen, and it just seemed like, well, that's nice, and look at that. Well, that guy blew up, and here come the shoots, and all this business. But after the 5th mission, you kind of begin to think about, wait a minute, they're not playing games down there. And so it began to, at least you thought about it. So when I started out, I just was the regular navigator. When I became a lead navigator, because you're in the lead ship, there were certain things you had to do. The busiest time was from the time that you started on the bomb run till that was over. So, but that was also the kind of the roughest time, because by that time, they know they've got the flak gun zeroed in on you. They know where your altitude is and so forth, and kind of all hell is breaking loose around you. But you are so busy that because you have to check with the bombardier, and you had to, the plane went on autopilot through the bomb site, and one of the things you had to do was to look at this indices that comes down on the bomb site and count out how many inches it is from the middle point, because that would tell the pilot how far away he was from taking over the control of the plane. When that indices got down to the middle, then the bombs dropped. But they wanted him to know just how much longer he had to wait before he took control of the plane. After the bombs are dropped, pilot took over, and you'd make your turn and get out of there. But actually, maybe it was good that you were busy at that time, because you didn't really have time to think about what's going on. But that was the busiest time, and after you made your turn and you start on home, well, then it kind of let down a little bit. When you got back home, you went to the briefing, because they wanted to see what you had to say. And one thing I remember is I was 20 years old then. I wasn't really drinking by that time, but one of the things they did, take you in the briefing room, and right in the middle of the table was a bottle of old overhauled rye whiskey. And everybody had to have a couple of shots of that, because you've been flying for 6-7 hours, you haven't eaten, and that was supposed to relax you. Well, it did, pretty good. But that was kind of my first experience in having a hard drink. Because when I graduated from high school, at that time, in my senior class, I don't know of anybody that smoked. I don't know anybody that drank. They did go out with girls, I do remember that. But it was a little different time. And it took a while before maybe you might start having a little extra beer or something like that. But I always just remember the first time taking a shot of that old Overholt. I never forgot it. But that would relax you. So, well.
One of my favorite movies of all time was The Great Escape with Steve McQueen and James Garner. Just a great movie. I'm sure you all agree, right? Well, Don was there. He was in The Great Escape prison, Stalag Luft 3. And in his book here, he talks about the differences in the movie and the actual happenings. So, and now I'd like Don to talk about that.
Well, thank you. When I wrote the book originally, I poo-pooed what Steve McQueen had done in the movie because I thought it never happened. Well, I had a book at home written by the fellow whose character Steve McQueen played. His name was Jerry Sage. He had an unusual story himself. He was captured in Africa. He was an OSS man, which was a forerunner to the CIA. Sage actually did all of the things that Steve McQueen did, including throwing his baseball over the little guardrail and then walking in where you were liable to be shot immediately if you did so. I had to rewrite that part because I found that all the things that Steve did, except the motorcycle ride, which was not a feature of the actual story, was actually done by this fellow Sage, and I recanted and rewrote it so that it reflected credit on him. The thing about the prison camp was that the Great Escape Camp was in western Poland. There were 10,000 flying officers in that one camp, Allied flying officers. How many planes do you think they had to shoot down to get that number? Plus, there were other camps with flying officers. Well, General Bub Clark wrote, and I knew him in the prison camp, he was a colonel then, that there were 10,000 bombers shot down, of our bombers, and 8,000 fighters. Now, I can't authenticate that for you, but that would show you the type of losses we were suffering. And even though the percentages got better flying, so well, your chances of getting to 28 missions were fair, but in the early days of 1943, as I found out from talking to prisoners of war who had been shot down in that period of time, the number of missions was less than 5 before they were shot down, some on their first mission, because they were flying without escorts. The prisoner of war camp was an experience I'll never forget. I have to say that the reason I'm dressed the way I am today is because I still have the mental state of a prisoner who said, never again am I going to be like an animal behind the barbed wire, starving, and being living a terrible existence. We were lucky that we did survive, but we had some terrible moments. That next winter of January 1945, the Russians were within 20 miles of our camp. We could hear their cannons going off. And so we knew that something was going to happen. Unbeknownst to us, Hitler had ordered we all be marched out of there, which we were, at 15 degrees below zero in a blizzard, with everything we owned on our backs. And we marched, I think, 35 miles the first night without stopping, except for we had a little rest period there. And we then marched to a little town called Moscow. We're going west from the camp because the Russians were coming from the east. And we managed to get inside a factory where there was heat. And we were able to take our clothes off for a change and get some relief from the cold. From there, a day and a half later, they marched us out, and we went another 10 miles in the cold weather and boarded cattle cars that were built to hold 40 men or 8 horses. Couldn't have both, but that a lot of people think that's what it was. They put 50 of us in each one of these cars, and there wasn't room for everybody to sit down at once. At one point, we pulled into Regensburg. I know now what it was. I didn't know then. And the air raid sirens went off. And the German guards locked us in and left. And we didn't know what the target was. Maybe we were sitting in this marshalling yard. Maybe we were the target. We had no knowledge of whether there was any signs. And it was nighttime anyway, so what are you going to do? We waited. They heard the planes flying over. We heard the bombs dropping in the distance. And then we moved on again from there. That was an experience that you don't want to live through, where you're locked in a cage and you hear an air raid siren go off. We went on from there on the train to Bavaria, to a camp called Stalag 7A. Now, this camp was built for 40,000 prisoners. When we got there were already 100,000. We added another 10,000. By the time we were liberated, it was 130,000. Conditions there were deplorable. It was the worst. We had fleas. We were starving. We lost weight. I think I got down to about 120 pounds. And finally, Patton's Army, on April 29th, 1945, I'll never forget that day as long as I live. The gunfire going on outside of camp. We heard cannon fire. And Patton's 14th Armored Division overran our camp. The Germans fled. We were in shock, most of us. I was in particular, because you don't actually realize, say, how can this be? We're free to go. Patton came into our camp 3 days later, May 2nd, and we stood at attention in our rags, in our awful condition. He said 5 words to us: "Have you enough to eat?" Well, that wasn't the point, really. It was what we could eat, not if we had enough to eat. And our stomachs were in such condition, we could not eat regular food. I actually went one day, walked down to a mess kitchen run by our Army, and they offered us food. We couldn't eat it. Went back to camp and waited for the people to come and get us. Patton, I had my impression of Patton at the time. He had a scowl on his face. And I thought, well, why is he scowling? We're happy, we're liberated. And I read finally in his diary, he said, what a fine bunch of men. But then I read a speech last year that he gave to his troops before the invasion. And in that speech, he said to his own men, "My men don't surrender. And I don't want to hear about any of you being captured unless you were wounded, and even then I expect you to keep on fighting." So I formed the opinion, as I said originally, that Patton was kind of disdainful of prisoners of war because we must have screwed up or we wouldn't be there. But I forgave him. He was a great general and a great character, and he set us free. That was the end of that experience. But I have to say that every prisoner of war who's been to prison for any length of time comes away with post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe that Senator McCain, if he'll forgive me, I believe he's still suffering from his imprisonment. We had these thousands of men there in those conditions. It had to affect you. And so when I read now about the post-traumatic stress disorder and the troops coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, I believe every bit of it, because in that war, like our war, the shooting came from every direction. You didn't know where it was coming from. You don't know what's coming next. You don't know who the enemy over there is. And that our men are legitimately affected by that. So I express sympathy for them, and I recommend that you consider that too when you read about them. Their war is terrible over there, and they're suffering for it. But I'm proud of my experience. I'm proud to be here. And when I raised my 4 sons, I used to tell them they'd have something for dinner that they didn't particularly like broccoli or something like that. And so I said, well, learn to enjoy that food, because someday you might be in a place where that's all there is to eat. And while the other people are making up their mind whether they're going to eat it or not, you can be gorging yourself on this food that you've learned to eat. But I'm proud to be associated with Jack. Jack and I want to say that briefly, were navigators who nobody told anything, who never got any respect. We had trouble just keeping busy off when there was nothing doing. And Jack and I would go down to the link trainer. Anybody know what a link trainer is? Okay. A link trainer is a dummy plane that flies electrically on the ground, and it's not an aerial flying airplane. Jack and I would take turns getting in the pilot's seat, pull the hood over, and fly on the instruments. Well, we didn't know how to fly in the first place. So the voice would come over the microphone. You are now 200 feet below ground. Pull up. So what we did, those crazy things we did were things that you did in combat to keep your wits about you. You couldn't think and dwell on what it was like to go on your next mission and where we're going next. You had to pretend that it didn't happen. If somebody got shot down, as I did, Jack told me later when I saw him after the war, he said I had to be philosophical about that. And, you know, maybe I expected more from Jack as such a buddy, but that's how we did it. You have to say, sorry, Joe, you're down. We miss you. We got to go on with our job.
He told me before we started, I said, what do you want to talk about? He said, I was a trial lawyer for 50 years, so I don't have to do much talking. But I'm looking at some serious medals here, guys. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I see Distinguished Flying Crosses. I see air medals with oak leaf clusters, and you proudly wear them, and rightfully so. Thank you so much for what you did for us.
Thank you.
I want to ask you this. We still got a few minutes here. What does being a B-17 crew member mean to you now? Do you keep up with your old buddies?
Well, they're all dying off. Jack and I are among the few that are left. My crew is all dead. So you became very close to those fellows because, for example, in the Navigator particularly, sat in the nose compartment of the B-17 with the bombardier, and we were there on takeoffs and landings. Well, the rules said get back in the back and go to the radio room and sit with your back against the wall. Well, we didn't pay any attention to that. We knew nothing was going to happen to us, and we did crazy things like that. Oh. Well, we shared this pilot. I flew only 2 missions with Steve King, and a couple of stories about Steve. He was recognized already before we got shot down as a real comer to be a leader in the group, and Steve had signed up for his second tour before he finished the first one. He was promised a promotion, he was promised a leadership role, and I think he had the toughest time when we got shot down because his eyes were on a career in the Army. But the story that Steve told most I remember was about his top gunner, Ray Wheeler. And Ray Wheeler had shot down 5 German fighters from his top turret. Steve went to Ray one time and he said, you know, when that fighter came onto us, you shot down, he said, what were you waiting for? And Ray said, well, I wanted them to get a little closer so I could make a sure kill. And Steve said, for God's sake, don't do that again. Shoot at him even if he's out of range. Don't try to scare him away. That was the kind of crews we had. They were guys that had tremendous guts, and they did what they were told to do, and they performed well.
For the last 17 years, it's been my privilege to be a crew member on the EA's B-17 aluminum overcast. And I've been all over this country, and I've heard thousands of these stories, and what a privilege it is to talk to these gentlemen and thank them for what they did. And right now, I'm going to ask all the veterans in the audience, would you please stand and be recognized? All the veterans, please. Now, all you people that are sitting down, you should turn to those veterans and thank them for your freedom. Over in the Warbird area, right over here in the gift shop, these gentlemen are going to be there in a few minutes signing autographs. And we want to encourage you to join the EA Warbirds of America, all of you. You don't have to be a pilot, just have an interest in the history and heritage of this country. Thank you so much for watching Warbirds in Review.